The internet is always a transnational communication medium, and it raises a number of questions about the problem of content. For example, if obscenity is defined in a very strict and narrow way in the Indian Penal Code, the fact that there is material that's made available to me which originates not necessarily in India, but originates in Sweden or originates in the US, etc., ensures in a sense that the entire prohibition of obscenity in the IPC becomes a bit redundant. Even if there is a book that is banned in India, but is not banned in Sweden, and the book is made available online, it makes the act of censoring the material in India itself redundant. Right? So there's the first question of jurisdiction in terms of reach. And one example of this is really the birth of what I would describe as queer subculture in India. Section 377 of the IPC, which criminalizes homosexuality, has been really a bane for the sexual minorities in India. And yet at the same time, with the emergence of the net, you have found the emergence of various spaces where people are able to contact each other and create a sociality which is otherwise prohibited by the law. And that can understandably be a cause of anxiety. The anonymous subject. In many ways, law is determined or predicated on the fixation of identities, on the creation of certain forms of legal identity. But the fact that the net allows for an anonymous subject then poses a problem. How does the law name you? How does it name you in the classical kind of sense? And then the example of free speech and censorship. And two good, interesting examples of this are Taslima Nasreen's book Dukhindata and Salman Rushdie's book Satanic Verses are both still banned in India, but the e-texts of these books are available, right? So there are also a number of civil society concerns. I've so far given you a list of the concerns of the state. Now, what are some of these civil society concerns? The first one is that the internet has for a long time been a space of relative freedom as far as communication is concerned. But what happens when you have increasing demands for censorship of material on the net? What are the kind of free speech concerns that emerge? The second is it is precisely the anonymity offered by the net that has made it such a popular medium for a number of people. So what happens when you ask for greater surveillance of the net, and what happens to individual liberty? The third are concerns about individual privacy. The fact that I can have a digital camera, walk around the city, take images of people and post them along with any kind of material in terms of comments that I want to make poses a threat of individual privacy. But I'm addressing this not as a concern of the state but as a civil society concern. Fourth, human rights movements and their use of the internet. In regimes which are particularly repressive, you will always notice that the first thing that is struck down in any moment of crisis is the closing off of particular websites or the shutting down of the internet itself. We have seen, for example, in the recent crackdown in Tibet, the Chinese authorities banned YouTube because there were people sending images from their mobile phones, from their digital cameras, onto YouTube to show the global kind of civil society what was actually happening there. There are questions of access to knowledge. A lot of us rely on the internet for our research, but the question is the internet really a public space? Or is there an increasing privatization? Anyone in a university, for example, will tell you that there's been a decline in subscription to offline journals because increasingly the move is towards online journals, none of which are actually extremely cheap. And from a developing country perspective, very often they come at very prohibitive prices. And the final concern, of course, is the digital divide or the gap between the haves and the have-nots of the information highway. I want to show you a picture which was recently circulating of Chinese soldiers holding, the robe of monks. It seems to suggest that, that a number of things that are staged within Tibet of, unrest by monks, etc., may also well be the role of the state. But the fact that this image would never be available to me were it not for a medium like the net. I mean, it's just the technological shift that has happened enables new kinds of ways of speaking truth to power. And my main concern as a civil society person is really about what are the kind of spaces of freedom that remain. There are also a set of conceptual questions that I want to raise, and we don't have too much time to go into them in detail, but I'll raise them and leave you to think about it a bit more. And the conceptual question really is about when the law tries to regulate the net, what does it say of the net? What is the theory of cyberspace that it has? Because the first thing to remember about the law is that the law is not merely a descriptive discourse, it's a productive discourse. What do I mean by this? That when the law describes or defines something, it does not just define it as though there were an existing reality outside of the definition, it also constitutes that object. So if the law, for example, were to describe this as a chair, it would, by virtue of the sovereign authority granted to the law, become a chair. Not that there is any objective link between the reality or its ontological reality and the definition that's given to it. So when it comes to the net, there is a similar question out here. The law can choose to define cyberspace in various modes. It can define it either as a technology, it can define it as a medium, or it can define it really as a space. And there are different legal implications arising from each of the choices that you make. So there is therefore an entire question of this cultural impact of legal regulation. Since you're talking about an arena that enables whole new modes of sociality, what happens when the law chooses one form of definition over the other? And are there alternatives that we can think of when we think about cyberspace? And I want to illustrate this conceptual problem by looking at one puzzle of law on the net. And this is a story about a rape in cyberspace, a rape in a community called the Lambda Mu community. Now, for those of you who were not around when the early days of the internet happened, in the early days of the internet, we didn't have the kind of visual landscape that you have currently. Now we're used to watching videos on the net, used to downloading songs on the net. But in the early days of the internet, all you had were text interfaces, right? So there were a number of games that were highly popular, which were known as RPGs or role-playing games, where people would come and participate in the game, but the only way that you participated was through a textual interface. So you would come there and type out, very literally. So if you wanted to move from one spot to the other, unlike now where you can actually scroll through visually, like in Second Life, in the early days of the net, you could actually have to type out. So you would type out something like, Lawrence Liang now takes 4 steps and walks across the room. So these were known as multi-user dungeons or MUDs. And multi-user dungeons were basically text-based role-playing games where people would, kind of take on particular identities and participate in an entire second life or in an entire virtual community. And a lot of this was extremely imaginative, so people would experiment with identity. They would assign for themselves completely fantastical characters they could never be in real life. And one example of this, for example, is in the Lambda Mu community, description of the living room. So there is no image. It says, it is very bright, open and airy here, with large plate glass windows looking southward over the pool to the gardens and beyond. On the north wall, there is a rough stonework fireplace. The east and the west walls are completely covered with large, well-stocked bookcases. An exit in the northwest corner leads to the kitchen and in a more northerly direction to the entrance hall. And the kind of characters that people assigned to themselves were also very interesting. So one of the characters described himself as a human-sized cyberpunk Tinkerbell with skin resembling the dull side of a piece of aluminum foil. Another person described themselves as being a petite reptile with tasteful pale purple scales. So there was this complete imaginary scale. Now the reason why I use this example is it really throws up certain philosophical questions. How do you draw the line between the real and the virtual? How do you draw the line between the real identity that you inhabit and your virtual persona? How many times, for example, have we encountered this scenario where you meet someone on the net and you talk to them and they completely, are outgoing, charming, gregarious, but when you meet the real person in real life, you think there is a disjuncture between the two, because the person is a lot shyer, actually is not as confident as he or she appears on the net, or vice versa. Right? This entire